parties represent the interests of the capitalist class and can never represent the interests of the working class. These parties cannot serve two masters. The workers will be squeezed more and more and will be forced to make hard sacrifices while the capitalists will fatten their pockets, whether it's Trump or it's Harris in the White House.
You see why both parties are here. Over the last decade, the richest 1% has captured 54% of global wealth. They have a record fortune of $44 trillion.
No matter who wins this election in November, the working class will ultimately lose, as billions will continue to be sent abroad to support the genocide of the Palestinians and a proxy war in Ukraine, while the 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 92% of Americans can't even afford a one-bedroom apartment.
Over 100 million people in the richest country on earth cannot afford their health care. Wages have stagnated for half a century. This is the reason that 69% of voters say that the entire U.S. political and economic system needs major changes or to be torn down entirely. The working class is right to be angry. They're right to want to fight. They're right to hate the establishment, to hate the status quo.
That's why we say no to both of these capitalist parties, and we say it's about time the workers have their own party.
Please stand up, comrades. Everybody, stand up, please. All in favor of launching the revolutionary communists of America, please raise your hands. Well, comrades, you are all officially founding members of the RCA.
Of a major American city. We just gave the world a glimpse into the future of the political landscape of this country, because the communist movement is just getting started.
Here, the belly of the beast. We have a duty to our class brothers and sisters around the world to finally overthrow the biggest threat to the world revolution, the American bourgeoisie.
Todos los trabajadores de Latinoamérica hemos sufrido por los intereses del imperialismo estadounidense. En nombre de la democracia se han masacrado a nuestros pueblos, han financiado golpes de Estado, han establecido dictaduras militares que han asesinado y han desaparecido a miles de trabajadores, y en México son cómplices de la violencia que existe con el narcotráfico, y resistimos y luchamos.
The enemy of the Trump voting working class is not the workers that were born in another country who speak a different language. The enemy of the working class is sitting in executive boardrooms watching us from their skyscrapers and rubbing their hands together when they see one section of the working class channeling its discontent against another section of the working class. They want to stoke the culture war because they know that it benefits their interests.
This country was built on racism and oppression. It is in the veins of capitalism. But we will achieve genuine reparations for centuries of slavery and centuries of colonialism by expropriating the capitalists and building socialism. There will be no more border walls, no more mass incarceration.
It's time for the communists to explain that the class war alone is the underlying conflict in this society. That the working class and the capitalist class have nothing in common. It's time for the communist generation to tap into the anger in society and channel it against its genuine enemy, the capitalist system, the capitalist class.
It is the working class that makes the hospitals, the schools, the buses function. We make the world run. The capitalists, the billionaires, the CEOs, they need us, but we do not need them. Expropriate the banks. Expropriate the monopolies. And on the basis of a government of the working class, we will transform society. We will cut the working week in half with no loss in pay, with full employment and education for all. We can get to work in actually improving society. We will build hospitals, schools, public transportation. Everyone will have access to quality, affordable health care. And we are going to confront the climate catastrophe head on. We are fighting for our future, for the future of all of humanity.
These red flags and this hammer and sickle stands for a world that is ruled by the working class. A world where nobody has to sleep on the streets. Where life is more than just working yourself to death, grinding through a miserable existence until you drop. We stand for a world of abundance. A world that's waiting to be born. We are America's communist generation. We are America's working class. And we will overthrow capitalism in our lifetime.
And Republicans build a communist party, and let's build the revolutionary communists of America.
So I'm going to read from the Manifesto of the Revolutionary Communists of America, continuing from where I left off last time. And this will be the meditation aspect of our daily practice. And after this, we will do the meditation, yoga, and martial arts. A fighting program for the Revolutionary Communists of America. The RCA is a party of class fighters committed to the complete overthrow of capitalism. We fight for a world of material superabundance and reject the artificial scarcity of a system based on the pursuit of profits. We fight to build a revolutionary leadership worthy of the name and to establish a workers' government that can mobilize the working class to tackle the capitalist roots of war, inequality, oppression, and climate catastrophe. As part of the struggle for the American Socialist Revolution, we fight for concrete improvements in workers' lives and offer a vision for how society could be reorganized once the working class wins political and economic power. We are proud members of the Revolutionary Communist International, which shares the same aims and is active in dozens of countries worldwide. Rebuild the labor movement through militant class struggle. Without organization, workers are mere raw material for exploitation. Only class struggle unionism, which starts from the premise that our interests and the bosses are diametrically opposed, can reverse decades of decline and put labor back on the offensive. We oppose all anti-union laws and fight for every worker's right to strike and join a union. We reject multi-tier contracts, concessions, and givebacks, and call on labor leaders to launch an all-out drive to unionize the unorganized. We fight for trade union democracy on the basis of one member, one vote. To combat bureaucracy and corruption, all union officials should be elected by the membership with the right of immediate recall and be paid no more than the average wage of the workers they represent. Communists built the American labor movement and formed the backbone of industrial unionism. It's time we return to our fighting roots. The best way to prepare for an all-out general strike is to successfully organize millions of workers in a wave of industrial strikes, demonstrating the colossal power of the working class in action. However, trade union organization and struggle are not enough. Workers need a class-independent political expression to coordinate their common struggle against the capitalist class as a whole. Down with the Democrats and Republicans. Build a communist party. American workers have no party of our own. The left is non-existent, and the labor leaders embrace class collaboration and compromise. In this vacuum, the Democrats and Republicans have succeeded in dividing and duping millions into voting for them as the quote-unquote lesser evil. Those who argue that these and other institutions of capitalist and imperialist rule can be made to serve two masters are deceiving the workers and leading them into dead-end class collaboration and reformism. Communists stand for uncompromising class independence and reject the false dichotomy of liberalism versus Trumpism, two sides of the same capitalist coin. To combat the distorted polarization of the culture war, we stand for class polarization and the class war. We support any reform or struggle that improves workers' lives and raises class consciousness, confidence, and unity. But capitalism cannot be gradually reformed out of existence. There is no solution within the limits of the system. The only way out of the impasse is a workers' government and a democratically planned economy that can guide society's transition through socialism to classless, stateless, moneyless communism. Far from the gray totalitarian caricature portrayed by our class enemies, the proletarian revolution will usher in a system of workers' democracy based on the direct participation of the masses in government and the economy. To achieve this, the working class needs a revolutionary party armed with Marxist theory to fight the capitalists in every workplace and campus, on the streets, and at the ballot box. Based on the momentous events that lie ahead, the class issue will come to the fore, and the united working class will settle accounts with those who oppress and exploit us. Nationalize the major banks and monopolies. Just 500 companies account for 2/3 of US GDP. To break with the irrational chaos of the capitalist free market, a workers' government would expropriate the essential levers of the economy. All nationalized companies would be run under democratic workers' control and management, integrated into a socialist plan of production to meet society's needs. The banking sector would be transformed into a unified, publicly owned and administrated entity to protect workers' savings and guarantee affordable loans to all. Communists reject austerity, privatization, and corporate handouts. We think the billionaires should pay for the crisis of their system, not the working class. Quality jobs, housing, healthcare, and education for all. Socialism is not only a good idea, it is objectively possible now, not in the distant future. Thanks to human ingenuity and technological advances, labor productivity is higher than ever, and we can produce enough wealth to guarantee everyone a phenomenal quality of life. Yet millions suffer from hunger, homelessness, unemployment, and disease. This is because capitalism is based on private ownership of the means of production and private appropriation of the wealth produced collectively by the working class. The socialist revolution will resolve the contradictions through social ownership, production, and distribution of society's collective wealth. Under a workers' government, what we produce and who has access to it will be democratically determined based on human needs. Any industry or company deemed too big to fall or otherwise essential for the functioning of society will be brought into public ownership and integrated into a rational economic plan. Eliminating the profit motive will unleash our species' vast creative and productive potential and raise living standards to unimaginable levels on an environmentally sustainable basis. For the first time in history, all humans will enjoy true quality of life, not mere formal equality before the law. Jobs. Under capitalism, some are forced to work 60 or more hours a week to make ends eat, while others languish on the sidelines because there's no room for them in the economy. We fight for a full-time job or a place in education for all. To combat unemployment, the workers and their unions, not the bosses, should have control over hiring and firing. Job training and hiring halls should be established in areas with high unemployment, with jobless benefits paid at full wages. A workers' government would launch an extensive program as useful public works to create millions of quality jobs and upgrade public infrastructure, transportation, and housing with accommodation for those with disabilities. A 20-hour work week and a national minimum wage of $5,000 per month, adjusted to keep pace with inflation, would allow everyone to contribute to the economy while allowing plenty of time for leisure, individual development, travel, art, science, sports, and more. Voluntary retirement with full wages at age 50 would make way for new generations of workers and allow retirees to enjoy their lives and enrich society in other ways. Housing. Under capitalism, housing is a constant crisis of skyrocketing rents, homelessness, overcrowding, urban sprawl, and gentrification. Excuse me. Whew. Buying a house is unaffordable in 99% of the country. A workers' government would establish a socialized plan for safe, quality housing for all, with rent fixed at no more than 10% of wages. Evictions would be a thing of the past. Foreclosed and vacant homes and land owned by the banks, private equity, and real estate monopolies would be expropriated and integrated into a rational plan. Current homeowners would be invited to participate on a voluntary basis. Healthcare. Capitalist healthcare is a nightmare. Millions have no access, and those who do must pay extortionate amounts for subpar care. Access to certain kinds of healthcare is limited, then granted, then rescinded again through cynical political games. We fight for a socialized healthcare system, free at the point of service. A workers' government would abolish health insurance. It would nationalize the pharmaceutical and medical industries, hospital networks, and related clinics, and integrate them into a democratically administered public health care provider, offering world-class services to all. Personal healthcare decisions would no longer be the business of corporations and career politicians. They would instead be made in private collaboration between patients and healthcare professionals, including decisions about reproductive, gender-affirming, mental health, and palliative care. Freeing scientific research from the profit motive would ensure everyone access to the latest medical technologies and treatments and allow us to combat epidemics and diseases effectively. Education. Under capitalism, most children receive only the minimum education needed to turn them into productive wage laborers for the capitalists. A handful of others attend elite universities and are trained to administer the institutions of capitalist rule. Communists fight for the best possible education for all, tailored to our individual interests and abilities, to maximize our contribution to society as a whole. We reject means testing, vouchers, charter schools, privatization, and corporate influence in the classroom, which exacerbate inequality and are used to attack teachers and their unions. A workers' government would nationalize private educational institutions and merge them with public entities into a unified system. Tuition and fees would be abolished, and student debt would be written off. Students in higher education would receive grants and paid internships equivalent to the minimum wage of $5,000 per month. After-school programs and community centers would be robustly funded to engage the youth and enhance their physical, intellectual, and emotional development beyond the classroom. Fight oppression. An injury to one is an injury to all. The working class makes up the overwhelming majority of society, and the repressive apparatus of the capitalist state is not enough to keep us down. The only way they can keep us from turning against them is by turning us against each other. Fight division with class struggle and unity. Communists stand on the front line of the fight against all forms of bigotry. We reject discrimination based on race, gender, or sexual orientation, and demand equal pay for work of equal value. Racism, sexism, transphobia, and xenophobia are poison in the workers' movement and must be driven out. We stand for socialist internationalism and fight against the imperialist policies that compel people to emigrate from their homes and loved ones. Fighting against every kind of oppression is not only a moral imperative, it is a precondition for forging the class unity needed to ensure successful revolution. A workers' government would end mass incarceration and release all political prisoners. Border walls, deportation centers, and surveillance would be relics of the capitalist past. Equal rights would be granted to all, no matter where they were born. The tribal sovereignty of American Indian nations and the right to self-determination of U.S. territories would be recognized in deeds, not only in words, as we fight shoulder to shoulder against our common class enemies. Genuine reparations for centuries of slavery and colonialism will finally be achieved once we appropriate the capitalists and begin building socialism. Fight women's oppression. We stand unconditionally for full reproductive rights, up to and including abortion, as part of a socialized healthcare system. The burden of raising the next generation falls heavily on parents and especially on mothers. With generous parental leave and accessible full-time childcare facilities, parenthood would be radically transformed. Women would be freed from domestic servitude through an extensive public network of quality, affordable restaurants, laundry, and other socialized services. Defend our rights. Bourgeois democracy is in crisis, and our civil rights and liberties are under constant attack. We defend basic freedoms, such as assembly and expression, not as ends in themselves, but as means for broadening the class struggle and preparing for power. A workers' government would nationalize the means of communication and democratize access to the media and meeting spaces. Combat the climate crisis with a socialist planned economy. The planet is burning, and millions of people face displacement and death. The capitalist climate accords are a cynical smokescreen to cover up the criminal squandering of our habitat driven by the short-term pursuit of profit. Capitalists have an entirely different attitude toward the relationship between humans and the rest of nature. A workers' government would immediately begin the transition to clean energy by retooling the international economy in collaboration with workers across the world. Displaced workers would receive paid retraining and guaranteed employment with no reduction in wages or benefits. Billions would be invested to develop mitigation strategies and new production techniques. It would institute a socialized plan of production that measures human progress in generations, not fiscal quarters. Excuse me. You cannot plan what you do not control, or control what you do not own. A workers' government would nationalize mining, logging, transport, oil, gas, and other energy production and resource extraction industries. The food production and distribution giants would be nationalized and integrated into a rational plan while protecting small farmers and agricultural workers' job security. On this basis, a massive expansion of the world economy could be realized in complete harmony with the environment. Workers of the world unite. The market economy and nation state are antiquated fetters on the further flourishing of humanity. Communists fight for world revolution and an end to artificial borders. Socialism is international or it is nothing. We must oppose imperialist intervention anywhere. No war but the class war. A workers' government would abolish all capitalist trade and bankers' agreements and write off the debts imposed by imperialism. It would slash the military budget and invest in social needs. In unity with our class sisters and brothers worldwide, our historic mission is to overthrow global capitalism, imperialism, and landlordism, and to build a world socialist federation based on genuine equality, cooperation, and solidarity. I might continue reading the manifesto of the International in just a moment. I'm just going to see how long it is. I'll stop there, and next time, either tonight or tomorrow morning, I'll read the Manifesto of the Revolutionary Communist International. So now I'm just going to sit and reflect on the things I just read. The fighting program for the Revolutionary Communists of America. The main points were to rebuild the labor movement through militant class struggle, down with Democrats and Republicans, build a communist party, nationalize the major banks and monopolies, quality jobs, housing, healthcare, and education for all. Focusing on jobs, housing, healthcare, education, fighting oppression. An injury to one is an injury to all. Fight division with class struggle and unity. Fight women's oppression. Defend our rights. Combat the climate crisis with a socialist planned economy. And workers of the world unite. So now we're just going to sit for a few more minutes quietly. And we'll listen to the revolutionary communists of America.
Years ago, the capitalist class argued that a new millennia of prosperity and stability was opening up. The Soviet Union had collapsed and the ruling class saw this as the final victory of capitalism, the dawn of a new golden age.
Liberal democracy is really all there is now, and we've seen that now in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Communism was in a sense undermined.
But in just a single generation, everything has changed entirely.
Our generation has known nothing but economic crisis, war, political instability, debt, alienation, and misery.
There was a brief upswing for capitalism from the late 40s to the early 1970s after World War II. But life has gotten harder by truly every metric since that period came to an end.
And that era of capitalist stability is never coming back. This half-century process of decline has now reached a tipping point.
It is self-evident, indisputable, and impossible to ignore that we live in a society in decline. Living standards have worsened for several generations. Meaningful job prospects are more scarce than ever. Meanwhile, the capitalist inability to manage climate change threatens the foundations of human civilization itself. That's why in the last 15 years, we have seen increasing political turmoil and radicalization. The 2008 financial crisis, one of our generation's earliest memories, was just the beginning of this process.
Then, in 2016, Bernie Sanders came onto the national scene. There was widespread interest in socialism for the first time in decades. But the reformist socialists like Sanders, AOC, and DSA capitulated to the capitalists in every way.
The time for reformist tinkering is long gone. We need to fight for the complete overthrow of capitalism. We need to organize for a socialist revolution in our lifetime. For the first time in generations, the idea of communism resonates with wide layers of society. A 2023 poll found that 20% of young people believe that communism is their ideal economic system. This process of radicalization has transformed the American political landscape, but it is only the beginning.
The next 10 or 20 years will look nothing like the last 80, and we need to prepare. The burning task of our generation is to organize these tens of millions of communists into a united political force.
We need to bring this new generation of communists together into a disciplined and professional organization.
With roots in every workplace, campus, union, and working class neighborhood. Already, tens of thousands of young people are ready to get organized in the real world. We just need to reach them.
Hundreds and thousands of us have realized that the power of workers flows from our numbers, and that as isolated individuals, we can achieve nothing.
We can't keep passively scrolling on Twitter, listening to leftist podcasts, or binging YouTube. The popularity of online communism is a symptom of the changing consciousness, but it offers no real solution. Our duty as communists is not to discuss or debate our ideas in the abstract, but to get to work building an organization that can carry these ideas into the class struggle. We need a new party.
A revolutionary party of action.
A genuine communist party. That is why we are launching the Revolutionary Communists of America.
A new political party to organize the tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of revolutionary communists in the United States.
The RCA sets out to build a revolutionary communist organization from coast to coast, with branches and cells in every workplace, every union, every campus, and every neighborhood.
With a presence already in over 30 US cities, we're not starting from scratch. But there is an enormous amount of work to be done.
Our present ranks represent only a tiny fraction of the revolutionary communists in the country,
who number in the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands.
In 1917, at a time not unlike our own, the whole world seemed plunged into the darkness of World War I, but the Russian Revolution showed the way forward. It was a beacon of hope and optimism. For the first time in history, our class, the working class, overthrew the capitalist rule and took power into their own hands. We are committed to organizing a new victory on these same lines.
We base ourselves on the most advanced ideas in the history of human thought, Marxism. We are guided by the ideas of Marx and Engels, the method of Bolshevism, and the legacy of the Russian Revolution. And as Lenin explained long ago, it is too late to form the party in times of explosion and outburst. The party must be in a state of readiness to launch activity at a moment's notice.
In other words, we need to build the Revolutionary Party now, so we're prepared in the future. With this instrument, our class will be able to end capitalism once and for all.
Communism is not just a good idea or an identity. We're not interested in people who just want to talk. We dedicate ourselves to conquering the ideas of Marxism, intervening in the class struggle, and fighting for revolution. We live in a world brimming with untapped potential, with unimaginable wealth, technology, just waiting to be unleashed for the benefit of humanity. But the profit motive and the capitalist system are fundamental barriers to further human progress.
The hard truth is that there's absolutely no future and no hope for us under this current system.
There is hope, but only in the struggle for a new society.
So if you're a serious communist, it's time to stop being a passive observer.
If you're tired of sitting around and watching everything get worse and worse, this party is for you.
If you want to fight instead of succumbing to this system that's in terminal decline, this party is for you.
If you want to play your part in history and help our class finally overthrow capitalism, this party is for you.
Help us bring together the tens of thousands of communists across this country.
Help us build the Revolutionary Communists of America.
Help us build the Revolutionary Communists of America.
Help us build the Revolutionary Communists of America.
Wrote an article about youth radicalization, and it had a poll from the Cato Institute.
It found that 34% of 18 to 29-year-olds have a favorable opinion of communism. 62% have a favorable opinion of socialism. And in big cities, 28% of all ages have a favorable view of communism. And these are just some examples of what a massive change there's been in US politics in the past 10 years.
Those would be astonishing if you had told someone like 10 years ago that that's the way that communism is going to be received. What an incredible shift. And this is another thing that's often raised in the comments. Everyone talks about the Overton window. This is like a piece of pop sociology that it's made its way. It's a buzzword now. This is one of the reasons why you have to support Zoran, because he's popularizing socialism. Now, I think an individual like Bernie Sanders, Zoran, by talking about socialism, that's to their credit. By attacking capitalism, very good. Like, we support those things. It does help to have public figures talking about this, but the Overton window is like kind of a linear view of how consciousness changes. Like, there's certain things that are acceptable within public opinion, and there's limits to that, and you can't exceed those limits or go too far into radical territory. Otherwise, your ideas won't be received. Well, based on what you're saying, it's like 30 million potential communists, or people who have a favorable view of communism. Is it really such a sort of Red Scare threat that he needs to be worried about, that he's going to out-radical people? The fact that he energized all those young voters, 50,000 activists, that's a small sample, a small taste of what he could really achieve if he were to conjure up a new party of the working class and say, we're here to fight, and we're not going to make deals, and we're not going to try to get along with the billionaires. We're going to fight against capitalism.
If he did that, if he built some kind of workers' organization, a workers' party of some kind, it wouldn't start out with the program that we would vouch for. But that would be a step forward. We would participate in that, put our ideas forward. As you were saying earlier, we're not in favor of so-called purity politics, because it's just not the reality. The working class does not wake up randomly one day and decide a revolution is necessary. That's the conclusion that's reached after years of struggle, years of crisis, testing different options. So that's going to be a process. And of course, forming a party and figuring out what kind of program is necessary is part of it. So we would participate in that. In terms of the potential for that in this question of the Overton window, for the viewer, Overton window, it's basically the idea of like the acceptable parameters of mainstream political discussion. And so you see people saying, well, Zoran's at least shifting the Overton window. You used to hear the same thing about Bernie Sanders. And I think it is true in a sense that individuals like Sanders or Mamdani can kind of catalyze this process. Like, obviously, when you have a major public figure talking about socialism, talking about single-payer healthcare in the case of Sanders, or free buses or rent freeze in the case of Zoran, it does kind of bring it to the forefront of political discussion.
But is it the case that until that person came along, everyone was just a blank slate politically, and then once the correct idea has come along, there emerges an interest in socialism? I don't think that's, I think above all, it's the economic crisis, it's the crisis of capitalism that makes people open to those ideas. And then it's true, individuals can come along and become like a focal point. Like if you look at Sanders, years leading up to 2016, he was an obscure figure. He was a senator in Vermont, but most people didn't know who he was. But it was years, I mean, it was coming off of decades of decline, economic decline. There was already an anger in society. The Obama presidency in 2008 had awakened certain hopes, but that quickly did not pan out. And so there was anger. Sanders comes along and is able to kind of give, again, kind of a focal point, kind of capture and catalyze that energy. But if he hadn't done that, I think something like this would have happened eventually nonetheless, because when people are watching their living standards decline, they start to look at different options. They start to lose confidence in the establishment parties and in capitalism. And so I think no matter what exactly happens with Zoran Mamdani, the general interest in socialism is going to maintain. Communism, a class struggle is going to continue to grow because Zoran is part of this broader process of like a revival of interest in socialism.
And a backlash against capitalism.
Yeah.
If the Overton window depends on somebody to kind of move the goalposts, who is it that's played that role for the rising popularity of communism? The 34% of young people under the age of 30 view communism favorably. It's not because there's any big, visible political figure who's out there making the case for communism.
Yeah.
It's an organic rejection of capitalism that's creating that mood. And I think for also the other thing about the Overton window is that there's a polarization happening towards the left and towards the right, if you like. I mean, even these words about left and right, now people are saying it's more like the up versus down. And I think that is really, it's a class sentiment that's coming to the fore, and it's looking for someone to tap into it and give it an expression. That's really the thing. And it's not that people are too afraid of radical politics. People want to tear down the system.
Yeah.
And they're looking for like some alternative and someone to give a proposal for how that can be done.
And I think a lot of these people, like, they voted for Zoran despite the fact that he's a Democrat. That wasn't like an essential feature of him winning. He happens to be a Democrat, but it was above all his program. And again, there's layers of people that have become socialists or become open to socialism. And so perhaps for many of them, it would have come off as an even more kind of like bold, independent, anti-establishment candidacy.
Yeah.
If it were genuinely separate from the Democrats.
And really another thing about the so-called Overton window is basically we're talking about how does mass consciousness change, which is something that as Marxists we're very interested in this question.
Yeah, we explain ideas don't drop from the sky. It's not just random. People form their ideas on the basis of their environment and their experience under capitalism.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about a decades-long process that's of capitalist decline and decay that's created this newfound interest in socialism and class struggle and communism.
Right, and we also know that sometimes decades-long processes can then lead to a tipping point where a leap is taken. One example that comes to mind is, remember in the summer of 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, there was this mass movement, but the specific act of burning down the 3rd police precinct in Minneapolis, the week after that, there was polls that said that 54% of the population saw that as a justified act. That's pretty astonishing. It was like something like 3/4 of the population felt that the anger behind the protest was justified. So mass public opinion was behind this protest, and even this de facto act of insurrection, like torching a police station. You would not think that that's within the Overton window, right? And probably the day before it happened, it wasn't, like people weren't in favor of that. Then it happened, but in that specific context of this mass movement, people are thinking about it as part of this unfolding event, like a mass protest against police terror. And they saw George Floyd, and like, that's the way consciousness is impacted. It's by events, and it can happen very explosively. Like that was a big leap forward for consciousness in the summer of 2020. Suddenly people are talking about not just community control of the police, defund the police, but like abolishing the police, like millions of people in the streets, basically taking the steps towards what could have become a pre-revolutionary situation if there had been a leadership for it. But that's the point that we're getting at, is that the so-called Overton window thinks of consciousness as being like a pretty slow-moving thing, and revolutionary politics is based on this understanding that consciousness might be conservative for long periods of time, but it can also take a leap forward. And the class struggle is about helping that consciousness to advance to the point where the working class realizes that the only way to fight for its interest, the only way to achieve the demands that it has, is to end the capitalists' control over the society, to break their control and to take that over and to plan it democratically. Now, if you want to arrive at that destination, that's for us the question of strategy. Like, how do you move forward towards that? For us, any little partial step would be great, but that would mean workers have to see themselves as an independent force, like an independent segment of society separate from the capitalists, and understand that the capitalists are the enemy, and the capitalists control the media, and the capitalists control the state, and they control the courts. Those aren't neutral institutions. Those are the instruments of the enemy. So how do we organize against them? This is the whole, it's like a question of your whole mentality.
Complete.
We're asking a question with this session. The question is, what kind of party are we building? And this is based on an organizational resolution that is circulated through the ranks. It's essentially intended to be an instrument in your hands for sharpening our understanding of our mission, of what we are doing with this party that we founded a year ago, with the intention of gathering the first 10,000 Bolsheviks into our ranks. And we understand that that recruitment target, that drive, the first 1,000 and the first 10,000 is really just a stepping stone for creating a mass party. What we want to do with this document and with this discussion is understand more vividly, how is this party going to grow? How do we intend to proceed from where we are today to a mass point of reference, to bringing the RCA to the status of a household name? What type of organization is it? What is the nature of a cadre organization? What is the nature of Bolshevism? Really, it's opening the door to broader questions. Understandably, a lot of people want to have a very concrete, a very practical response to this. One of the comrades in Ventura, California, submitted to the portal a little report that we published in last month's issue of The Communist. It said, people often ask us, what does the party do? Comrades might be tempted to answer with a list of organizational points. We attend weekly meetings, study Marxism, go to protests. Instead, I tried to provide a vision of our strategy to overthrow capitalism. At our current stage, we're recruiting a layer that is already drawing advanced conclusions about the need for communism and revolution. We're building a network of Marxist cadres throughout the US, skilled revolutionary propagandists and agitators who will form the nucleus of a mass communist party. I used recent examples, BLM and the Palestine Solidarity Movement, to explain why we need a clear leadership and a program to succeed. As we get organized, revolutionary ideas will be a bigger point of reference in future mass movements, and we need Bolsheviks in every key workplace, neighborhood, campus, and union, starting with you. The comrade said, everyone I explained this to was ready to give their contact information, and one even asked me point blank how he could become one of the first 10,000 Bolsheviks. Said he would sign up for dues when he got home. I think this is a model response. And what we wanted to do with this document and with this session, understand more deeply what is the entire strategy, because if we can see the strategy clearly, then everything else will flow from that. And I think the United States has a very impatient, sort of pragmatic temperament. I remember having a small group of comrades in one of our first iterations of a branch back in California, in the small town, rural Northern California that I grew up in, having a meeting about revolution. And it just so happens we were on the high school campus, the sidewalk's right here. One of my cousins walks by, sees us, oh, what are you guys doing? And I'm trying to get him to go away, and I said, look, we're having a meeting. Oh, well, what's the meeting about? Well, it's about revolution. And his response kind of sums up what people think when you say that word. He said, oh, do you need guns? We said, not at this stage, thank you. But a lot of people, and I would say the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the left, people who want to have a revolution, having that goal doesn't necessarily give you a clear understanding of how to arrive at a force that's capable of making that possible. And I think that's the nature of Bolshevism, is getting to the heart of this thing. It's always been a difficult thing for people to understand. How do you build the right kind of instrument? It's a very modern question. This question was answered for the first time in this book, What is to be Done? And I think this is the book you can read over and over and get more and more from each time that you read it. Admittedly, it's not easy to read the first time around. It assumes that the reader is swimming in certain waters. It's written for an audience of Russian revolutionaries in 1902 who understand the recent history of their movement, the debates that are raging. It's a polemic. But once you understand, once you get to the heart of what's being argued, all the content is there. Everything that you need in order to understand what it's going to take for us to build this kind of party, to build modern day 21st century Bolshevism, is contained in Lenin's argument. And what was happening at that time was that the revolutionary movement was boiling up. It was raging. The number of people that wanted to overthrow the Tsar were it was a human tidal wave, and they were rushing into the revolutionary movement. In fact, the Tsarist prisons were overflowing with revolutionaries, and Tsarist prison cells were a sense of a cadre school. It was a university. You get locked up for 5 years, and there's not much you can do except read and write and think. And a lot of cadres got their education, not in a very pleasant setting, but in a pretty effective one, after all. Lenin was one of these. He was arrested in 1895, 1 year after moving to St. Petersburg, and spent the next 5 years in Tsarist prisons and in exile camps. And I think you can imagine that he was basically cooking this up. What is to be done was a product of that long period of thinking about what the movement needed. But every time the Tsarist police would come and carry out raids and sweep away one layer of leadership, another wave would pour forward, and it would just keep growing. The problem is there was a very low political level in general. You had a network of discussion groups, but you didn't have any kind of professionalism. There was no central force to coordinate it. And so Lenin could understand that you needed to bring this thing together, you needed to concentrate it and give it professionalism. He was fighting against primitive methods, against amateurism, and he understood something that nobody else really did, at least at a degree that no one else really did, is that if you want to give it that hardened core and professionalize a force like that, that's not an organizational, administrative, technical task. That is a political task. It's an ideological task. And what that means is the step you need to take is the step of training cadres deeply and thoroughly in revolutionary theory. Now, we can put the important information, put the bottom line up front. That's what we need to do today. That is the one key to our strategy from which everything else flows, to raise our political level, to train cadres, to train hundreds and then thousands of cadres. That is the only way for us to get to 10,000, but not just to grow in numbers, but to grow in quality, to become the kind of force that can actually wield influence and be a factor in the situation. Understandably, a lot of impatient young leftists don't like this answer. And they didn't like it at the time Lenin put it forward either. They called him, well, they didn't use uniting people around a single worldview, and I think we're making progress in this room. I think we have a single worldview represented in these ranks and in the RCA today. We've come a long way. If you do this, certain things will flow organizationally from that. If you have people that think like Marxists and they have the same method when they're analyzing events, if they have a shared understanding of the mission they're trying to fulfill in history, then it creates a certain mentality, and you get iron discipline. That's a voluntary revolutionary discipline based on commitment. And that's the way that you fight amateurism. These methods that you had, basically a lack of coordination, a lack of agreement, people rowing in different directions. If you want a force that's powerful and yet flexible and agile, something that's steadfast, that's not going to break apart when it gets tested under strain of events, then you need people, you need to build it out of a special material. That's people that understand history, how history unfolds, the laws of history, and their role in that process. And that's exactly what the Bolsheviks achieved. In a sense, what is to be done is like the mission statement. In Russian, что делать? It's like what to do. It's like, here's what you do. That's what he was laying out. 15 years later, they completed the mission. 15 years late, separated 1902 from 1917. And in 1913, a few years before that victory, this is how a Tsarist police reported the impact of the Bolshevik cadres. He said, the faction of Leninists is always better organized than the others. This is an internal report, obviously. Stronger in its singleness of purpose. They're more resourceful in spreading its ideas. Its circles are scattered throughout all the cities. They're the most energetic. They seem capable of tireless struggle. They're constantly organizing. That's because they had a shared ideology. It's the political clarity that created that kind of effective organization. He also explained that the role of the party is not to tail end the working class movement, but to raise its sights, to raise its horizons, to show the way forward. We're not here just to support from the back ranks. We're here to try to explain with clarity, here's the way forward, this is the way, and try to win leadership on that basis. So how do you achieve this result is the question. I think many revolutionaries would probably like to have a well-disciplined, solid organization. But again, there wasn't clarity as to how to arrive to this thing. A few weeks ago, I went to a branch meeting in Brooklyn, and we had a really good discussion about this document. Comrade Laura was there and made a good analogy. Said that capitalism is like a massive wall that needs to be battered down. And you think about the mentality of most people who are anti-capitalist, they want to batter down the wall. And they hate capitalism, and they see with an urgency, you know, the world is burning, all these people are suffering, we need to batter this down. But they don't really think what it's going to take, so they go straight to the wall with their bare fists, and they just start hammering. And they eventually get burnt out. And the Bolsheviks are those in the crowd that are like, let's take a step back, folks. This isn't working. We need to have an instrument that's suitable for battering down a massive wall like this. And that means we need to step back from the wall and start building it. And here's a construction site over here. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to be easy. But this is the only thing, a massive battering ram that the entire working class can hold on to. And then we're going to be able to batter it. So let's go. And then you try to recruit people to this effort. And some people still don't get what you're doing. And they're like, okay, well, you're saying we should abandon the wall. We can't do that. This is urgent. People are suffering. People have immediate needs right now. You want to go have this abstract construction project over here. We don't understand what you're doing. This is basically the debate that Lenin was having with the revolutionary movement in what is to be done. And so the short version is, yeah, he also said, what is the practical step that we can take? A press. You need media. You need a way to package ideas and organize people around that so you can get on the same page that way. If you have a place where you're producing a stream of analysis, producing theory, producing reports, and it's not just written media. In our time, we have podcasts as well. We have YouTube. We have Against the Stream. We have, how many watch Against the Stream every week? Look at those hands, Fred. Let the International Center know that, well, maybe that has something to do with the political unanimity we have in the party. It's nourished by weekly input. This is what Lenin was talking about. You need a way of getting people on the same page. That's what he was trying to build with Iskra. People said, oh, you're dogmatic, and you're too literary. And people say the same thing. Oh, the Trots, they have papers. They write articles. Well, they didn't understand it then. They don't understand it today. And we can leave those critics to their methods. Our methods are working pretty well so far, I'd say. We can look at the question of what is a cadre organization in general. And we've often done this in the form of analogies. There are multiple analogies. It's not just the military analogy. The comrades at the center know that I've been doing a bit of a rabbit hole into military structures, and I'll get into that. But it's not the only one. Anytime you have to have large numbers of people mobilized suddenly to achieve something, you need cadres. Anytime you need large numbers of people to come and respond to an emergency and get something done, and they need to be directed by a force that's already thought through, how do you direct what needs to, what is it that we actually need to achieve, and how do we go about it? You need cadres to be the leadership of that massive operation. Think of any kind of emergency. You have a natural disaster, an earthquake, a flood, things need to be done. You need people mobilized. You have an epidemic breaks out, a pandemic. The CDC has its cadres. They actually have a pretty thorough explanation for their personal how to roll out a cadre. And a cadre, by the way, it means framework. It's French. A cadre is an individual part of this structure, or it could refer to the structure as a whole. So don't get confused. Sometimes you can talk about a medical cadre, and that's talking about the members of this unit. But what is a cadre? It's a special organization, and it's small, and it's tight-knit, and it has the ability to become massive. That's a pretty cool feature. And the ability to become massive very rapidly comes from certain qualities that the small group has. It's the level of expertise, the level of training, the level of professionalism and discipline. It takes a long time to basically make in concentrate the ingredients that you need on a massive scale. The concentrated version needs the ability also not just to be professional, disciplined, well-trained and educated, the ability to impart information out into a larger structure. Why framework? Because it's the outline of a much larger organization that can then be filled out. So you could think of it like a skeleton. You know, you need a structure that's sturdy, that's not going to break, that can uphold other tissues and organs. You know, a framework can be built out. You can think of it also as a foundation. There's a lot of different analogies. You need something solid, and then you can have a mass that rests upon this. So in the case of, like, say, a wildfire, in 2020, among all the other apocalyptic events, the western half of the U.S. was on fire, if you remember. And they mobilized 85,000 personnel, not just fire departments from all over, but all kinds of agencies. The National Guard was out there. You had all kinds of law enforcement, medical responder units. And think about 85,000 people is a pretty good sized army. They need to be fed, and they need somewhere to sleep sooner or later. And they need a lot of supplies, and they need fuel and trucks, and you need to have like decision making to purchase things, and you need and the supply line has to be established very quickly. So when something like this happens, you have what's called an incident command system, and you have a general staff that's established. And the leadership of every unit, you have a department for organization, for planning, for logistics, for finance, is going to be someone that has been thoroughly prepared for this emergency, that has thought through all the contingencies, and that knows this is the resources we have, here's the plan, if this happens, we're going to do this. And they start rolling out a response, and they're going to recruit members of different agencies, and each one, it's a very thorough division of labor. They figured out decades ago that if you don't have this figured out, you can't really do it in the midst of an emergency. It leads to chaos. You don't know who's responsible for making decisions, who's in charge, and who's going to report back, and how is it going to get done. It all needs to be figured out. So you have cadres in place, and they're going to lead the response. Any incident like this typically is a question of mobilizing, you deal with the issue, and then you demobilize back to the cadre. You don't need a standing army to respond to the next wildfire. In a sense, we're trying to mobilize and not demobilize. We're trying to build our forces and not lose forces. But in the history of the revolutionary movement, sometimes you have, naturally, a massive filling out of the ranks of a revolutionary party, and then after a revolutionary defeat, look, 1905, the Bolsheviks, there was more than one Russian Revolution, right? It was 3. The first one was in 1905. The Bolsheviks were not much larger than our forces today. In the course of that revolution, together with the Mensheviks, they all came together. Huge events, right? Now the workers are looking for a revolutionary. They're pouring into the ranks of the Bolsheviks. They grow to 150,000. I mean, that's a massive expansion. After the revolution's defeated, now demoralization sets in. Anyone who joined but wasn't part of the general staff, wasn't professionalized, hadn't studied Marxism, didn't really have a long view of history, is now also demoralized, and the thing disperses. They basically reduce back down to a tiny core. That was a very difficult period. But you see, there's a cadre, there's a basic organizational feature that's happening beneath the surface. Well, this is what happens when you're responding to a wildfire. This is how armies are raised as well. And I do think that the military analogy is worth examining in detail. It's not just a metaphor. It is a cadre organization, and it's probably the most thoroughly worked out. They've had centuries to figure out how do you structure things in order to convince large numbers of people who have no military experience to rapidly get trained, become part of a unit, follow orders, and risk their lives. That's kind of a logistical issue, and it's not easy to do. And what you have are officers, and you have enlisted personnel who can make this happen. That's the cadres of a military. And the whole military, if you look at it as a big, vast, you could look at an army and just say, that's, okay, what's an army? That's a huge number of soldiers, and they're all wearing a uniform, and they have an arm, and they're ready to go into combat. Well, on the surface, that's what it is. In reality, it has a structure, and the structure is that's going to be permeated by sergeants. Sergeants are an enlisted soldier who's been promoted to the rank of a non-commissioned officer, and every unit is going to have sergeants, and they're going to have other ranks as well. And this is the way that troops are trained, assigned to a unit, mobilized, and then sent into battle. Look at the Civil War, for instance, to see how we also have this expansion of the troops, right? The beginning of the Civil War, you have the North. They have 15,000 enlisted soldiers, and that was in the standing army, and around 1,000 commissioned officers. They grew, in the course of the war, if you count up all those who enlisted into the Northern Army, from 15,000, right? They grew to 140-fold growth to 2.1 million on the basis of those initially 1,000 officers, and then other people had to be trained rapidly to become officers. The whole thing, time is of the essence, right, when you're faced with a war. The Confederates did something similar. They had just 750 officers, and initially mustered 15,000 troops and continued to build from there. Over the course of the war, that side grew 80-fold. 1.1 million ended up joining on the southern. In total, you had 3 million soldiers enlist on both sides. And that's again, it comes down to the core of officers who's prepared to take recruits and organize them and then let them tell them what to do. I mean, imagine being in that position. You have to know the drill, right? And so just to run through this a little bit, at the risk of bringing you all into the rabbit hole with me, we will come out on the other end, and I think it will be helpful. But stay with me here. The smallest unit of the U.S. Army or the Marine Corps it's called a team or a fire team. There's 3 to 4 soldiers, and it's going to have a leader. Even at that small scale, I think this is like the size of one of our smallest cells, right? At that small scale, the leader of a team will typically be a sergeant. In the Marine Corps, it'd be like a lance corporal. We're talking about someone with 2 to 4 years of experience. Oftentimes, in the last couple of years, we were forming a cell of 3 or 4 comrades, putting in charge of that somebody who was recruited 2 or 3 months ago. And, the military doesn't do that. we weren't sending them into combat. We were sending them into campuses and workplaces. But you put a few of these teams together, everything works in 3s or 4s. You take one unit, put them together, then you got the next unit. That's a squad. 8 to 12 people is a squad. That's going to have in its leadership a staff sergeant. So this is someone that's got like 6 years of experience. Think a large branch, 10 or 12 comrades. Do you have someone that joined in 2019 leading that? Probably not in most cases. Again, put a few squads together. Now you have a platoon, 30 to 50 people. This is going to have a commissioned officer who's been to some kind of a military academy at minimum, a lieutenant who's been to West Point or reserve officer training or some kind of thing like this, 4 to 6 years of education to lead that group. And that's like a district. That's our Brooklyn district. There's a certain level, and each of these units has one cadre in charge of overseeing the unit who's answering to someone above them and who has basically 3 or 4 people below them giving mentorship to, giving guidance to, but also giving orders. Now, obviously there's a difference, comrades. I'm not saying, we're not building a paramilitary organization. It's different. We're not building a chain of command either. It's seniority and years of service. It's not the same for political leadership because we're not training a network to hand down orders and people to be obedient to that. That's not the way it works. We're trying to build a network that hands down like political clarity and inspiration. And you are trying to build like mentor relationships of training cadres that can help someone understand Marxism better, build their confidence, their clarity, and their ability to explain these ideas to others. Because after all, we're not going, the combat that we're going into, the class war, a cadre of a class war, think about it. The military is sending people to spread destruction and misery and to spread artillery. We're trying to spread ideas and to spread the influence of a revolutionary program. And so for that, you need cadres every bit as much as a military does, but it's a different type of cadres and it's a different type of structure. So I thought many of these things were quite interesting. They want it to be a very rock solid structure. Sometimes it becomes not so solid, by the way. Sometimes the thread connecting soldiers to officers becomes quite tenuous. and we can talk about that. But you have a cadre density throughout the army. That's the thing that needs to be understood, is that 15 to 20% of the troops at a large scale are going to be officers or non-commissioned officers. If the RCA was a military unit, it would be a battalion, and it would probably have 150 to 200 officers and sergeants who have an average of like 6 years of experience, more at higher levels, less at lower levels. And so this is basically, if you look at the structure we're trying to build, something that's solid, something that holds together, but we're not just trying to sustain a group of 10,000. See, when we get to 10,000, that's not when we all give high fives and then our work is done. We're trying to build something that can, our work really will begin when we have these kinds of numbers. The session we just talked about is deploying cadres into high-stakes situations to be able to make decisions and to counter this vicious enemy that we've been talking about, the capitalist class, the most vicious that history has ever seen. And so we need serious leadership for that. I think it's also, there's a number of things. How much do I want to keep talking about the military before? Well, one other thing here is that I found this document. There's a lot of things on the internet, and one of them is Raising an Army, 10 Rules. And it's not a joke. This guy is a mercenary private contractor who works like for the U.S. imperialists. When they go in and destroy a country, then you know that the imperialists have to rebuild an army. They often do a bad job of it. But this guy was critical of the Pentagon's system, and he's got 10 rules. He says the first one was to drop the Pentagon's train and equip mentality. Let me just read you this. Raising armies is more sophisticated than this. It involves growing leaders, building institutions, instilling professionalism. Training and equipping alone only gives you better dressed soldiers who can shoot straighter. It goes on. Number two is, secondly, you have to understand this is a deeply political activity. Technical approaches that ignore the politics will fail. Here's another. I'm not going to go all 10, but another one. You have to instill a professional military ethos. That's another way for saying you need political education. You need ideological training. Starting in basic training, imbue respect for the rule of law and allegiance to the Constitution. This was, again, someone who built an army in Liberia in 2014 or early 2000s. It says Liberian recruits spent as much time in the classroom as they did on the rifle range. So when you're building, he says, if you don't do this, you're going to have an army of privates. Basically soldiers with no experience and no qualifications to lead and to command and to hold things together. And of course, an army like that just falls apart. He said selecting for leadership is difficult. It takes 20 years to make a colonel in the U.S. Army. A colonel, I think, would oversee like a brigade of 5,000 or something like that. And yet, the countries can't wait that long. They call this line of business, they don't just call it army building, they say security sector reform. And even that is a little strong, so they call it SSR. And so the last rule is, lastly, be humble. SSR is a marathon, not a sprint. Whether one is raising an army of 2,000 or 200,000, the methods are essentially the same, differing only in scale and scope. So I think we can take some of these methods, some of them don't really apply. The firefighters are also organized in a paramilitary organization. I thought this was interesting. There's patterns to this, right? New York City has 5 borough commands. Each has a borough commander. There's 9 divisions throughout. Each division has 4 to 7 battalions led by a battalion chief. Each battalion consists of 3 to 8 firehouses. That's around 200 firefighters. Each firehouse consists of 1 to 3 fire companies, each led by a captain who commands 3 lieutenants and 12 to 20 firefighters. In short, you can see when you need to mobilize large numbers of people to do something risky, it's good to think through the leadership structure. And this obviously applies not just to, think about what was achieved in 1917. This is basically, I think you're going to understand it better now after going through all this detail about the military thing. You had a general staff at the beginning of that revolution. In February 1917, you had 8,000 members of the Bolshevik Party. These were experienced people. These were people that had been through a lot. The Revolutionary Party had grown, had collapsed, had grown again in 1912, 1913. World War I starts, it collapses again. It's demoralizing. You need people, if you're going to be in it for the long haul and go through all of that, You need people who have a long view of history and understand what they're really doing at a deep level, and are not just going to be swayed by how things are going in the recent period. So that's the cadres. Over time, you forge something that is based on depth and clarity. Well, that's what you had essentially at the beginning of 1917. Now, they put forward an idea, right? The idea is, yes, you've overthrown the Tsar. The February Revolution overthrew the Tsar, but set up a capitalist government, a provisional government in its place. Lenin's message is, we're not going to be part of this government. It says it's a revolutionary government. It's not. It needs to be overthrown as well. We need to bring the working class to the realization that this is not their government, and that in order to achieve the basic material, the immediate urgent demands that the working class made this revolution for, like we need something to eat, we need to stop sending our youth to the front into a meat grinder. In order to achieve that, you have to overthrow the capitalists. This is the message. This is the program, right? All power to the Soviets. So this 8,000 is now the cadre there to transmit the message. Like the incident command begins, right? Now here's what we need to do. Go out and spread it. And you have agitators who know how to connect with the crowd. And you have people, correspondents, who know how to produce leaflets. And you've built up an apparatus of media that, as Lenin said, you need to build a machine and build it up to a degree of perfection that you can be able to inform the working class of Petrograd overnight. That's exactly what they built. And they informed the working class many steps of the way, night after night. Posters all over the streets of Petrograd. They were communicating. The whole thing is like you've built a massive apparatus capable of communicating on a massive scale, communicating to millions. Now, how do you build an army of communicators? Well, you have to have a lot of discussion and political clarity, and those people need to have depth. And being a good agitator means being rooted in a very thorough, very deep, very well-rounded understanding of the issues, so that you can say, this is getting to the heart of it. You can cut through something, make it very simple. Plekhanov, one of the founders of Russian Marxism, explained the difference between propaganda and agitation. Propaganda is explaining many ideas to small numbers of people. We're talking what we're doing, books, theory, a view of history, right? A consistent ideology, a thorough philosophical foundation. That's propaganda. Agitation is few ideas to many people, but you can't just choose one or the other. There's a sequence to this. In order to create agitators who are effective, who are able to connect with the crowd, you have to train them in propaganda, very thorough training in Marxism. And at that level, then you have a Fiona Lully who can get on GB News and just send zingers and expose the hypocrisy of the ruling class.
We've seen from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is an anti-Semitic chant calling for the eradication of Israel, the eradication of Israelis, and the eradication of Jewish people.
No, you're a liar. You're a liar.
And when a Tory politician says, aren't you going to defend Britain?
When threats are growing, it requires all of Britain to lean in, as we've done in the past, hesitantly though at first, to say we're going to stand up and we're going to be firm and we're going to defend Britain.
There is no all of Britain. There's you guys and there's everyone else, right? If Putin is a threat to the working class in Britain, I don't trust Keir Starmer, I don't trust David Lammy, I don't trust the defence companies, I don't trust the billionaires, I don't trust the establishment as people who are going to defend the working class in Britain.
A class perspective, very simple. Well, 9/10 of the revolution was winning over the working class to a revolutionary program. And what Lenin understood as early as, probably back in those Tsarist prison cells, is that you need to train cadres very thoroughly in Marxist theory and unwavering Marxist theory. It's like we have to fight eclecticism. We don't take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Trotsky, they were the ones who got to the root of it. And their view is consistent. When you read one, you're reading all four. And you realize that. And any real Marxist, when you realize it, you realize it. And you can't unrealize it. There's one Marxism. There's not many Marxisms. And when you understand it, then you see its power. We're trying to build something around that realization. And that's what Lenin understood. That is the thing that you have to do. Very few people have understood it through history, but we are the thread of those who have understood it in this international. If you think about it, it's kind of like you have an uprising is also one of these emergencies that's going to have an incident command set up, and they're going to have a general staff to respond to it. And it's going to be a pretty serious thing. Now, it's going to be essentially cadre versus cadre, right? Like one structure of leadership and response versus another structure of leadership and response. And in a revolution, you have one of them win. One of them was more prepared than the other. And one of them was more ready to enlist support in terms of numbers than the other one was. And the one that thought it had solid command, see, the military structure is about command and control. That's openly what they say. We're not about command and control. We're about political clarity. We're about truth. I mean, dialectical materialism is the thing that's guiding us. And so which one is ultimately stronger? I mean, revolutions, once you have mobilized the working class, the other one can melt away very quickly. I say this because we have left down to us a pretty awesome remnant of history from 1917. This Trotsky reproduced a dialogue that took place among Tsarist officers when the February Revolution had basically had won, but they're realizing in the Central Command that they're realizing this fact through this conversation. And here's two generals, General Ivanov and General Khabalov. Okay, let me just read through the thing. How many troops are in order and how many are misbehaving? Khabalov's reply: I have at my disposal in the Admiralty building 4 companies of the Guard, 5 squadrons of cavalry and Cossacks, and 2 batteries. The rest of the troops have gone over to the revolutionists, or, by agreement with them, are remaining neutral. Soldiers are wandering through the town singly or in bands, disarming officers. Which railroad stations are guarded? Response: all the stations are in the hands of the revolutionists and are strictly guarded by them. In what parts of the city is order preserved? Response: the whole city is in the hands of the revolutionists. Wait, hold it, there's more. The telephone is not working. There's no communication between different parts of the city. What authorities are governing the different parts of the city? Response: I cannot answer this question. Are all the ministers functioning properly? Sir, the ministers have all been arrested by the revolutionists. What police forces are at your disposal at the present moment? None whatever. What technical and supply institutions of the War Department are now in your control? I have none. What quantity of provisions is at your disposal? There are no provisions at my disposal. How many weapons, artillery, and military stores have fallen into the hands of the mutineers? All the artillery establishments are in the hands of the revolutionists. What military forces and staffs are in your control? The chief of staff of the district is in my personal control. With the other district administrations, I have no connections. So in the key moment, I mean, all of the command and control counts for nothing if the whole mechanism breaks down, and history has shown many times the kinds of conditions that lead it to break down. That is, comrades, if our cadre are powerful enough, if they're strong enough, if they're prepared enough. And that is the whole point of the grounding in theory. How do we know how far along we are in creating a revolutionary military academy, a red West Point, a revolutionary war college? Well, I think you have a good example that came out not long ago from Denmark. This was something that was circulated in RCI Bulletin 23. Now, we explained that the Danish section is doing quite well, right? It's a growing section, fast-growing section, very energetic in a small country. The working class of Denmark is just over 3 million people, which means that we have almost 1 comrade per 10,000 workers. And when they reach 1,000 comrades, there'll be 1 comrade per 3,000 workers. If what they had right now was like the U.S. population in terms of the working class, it would be like having 13,000 comrades right now in Denmark. So they're not doing bad, but that's why they're getting on the radar of the ruling class and their establishment media. And the largest paper in Denmark, the largest liberal paper, had this expose of journalists that went undercover. Well, he says I infiltrated. He says by infiltrating, I talked to a very eloquent, open-minded, friendly young communist. I expressed interest in Marxism and immediately got invited to a branch meeting. And he said, I didn't know what to expect. I thought it was going to be something absurd, probably, like people dressed up like Soviets or old-time nostalgics about the Soviet Union, or maybe hippies. I didn't know. Well, the title, I think the title of the article is something like, I infiltrated a communist meeting. I expected something absurd. What I found was the key to victory. Allow me to read to you extensively from this article. because the way he says it, the way one of our class enemies says it is almost better than any comrade could have. The presentation, he's describing the meeting, right? There's a young comrade gives a lead off. The presentation, which was well prepared and well formulated, the level of depth of the discussion would take most people's breath away. Even relatively inexperienced attendees were able to recite and understand Marxist works and argue articulately from them. All of them had a broad knowledge of everything from socioeconomic conditions and economic history to war history and philosophy. The Revolutionary Communist Party must be said to be able to educate and train its members to a degree that enables them to clearly and convincingly present the Marxist message. Literally, even the newest members, the lowest common denominator, were at a higher level than the average Dane and the average liberal. Despite great diversity of age groups and educational backgrounds, all members, new and old, are apparently encouraged to immerse themselves intellectually and study Marxist theory thoroughly. In addition, they learn to formulate their knowledge as arguments, to write speeches, to debate, and so on, with the result that even a relatively new and young member of the party can be considered a top-tuned, well-oiled machine when it comes to defending the Marxist-Leninist vision. Another observation: although the 2-hour-long debate covered a wide range, all topics and questions were considered from a Marxist perspective. In formulating their arguments, the party's members took an uncompromising point of departure from the theory behind the party's ideology. He's like, wow, they're consistent. They all have the same view. And this is the conclusion. However much we may disagree with the Marxist worldview, we must recognize that part of Marxism's gains can be attributed to the fact that without apologizing for itself, it actually tries to deliver clear and unequivocal answers to humanity's problems, big and small. We must realize, here's the end, we must realize that the ideological battle is still raging, and that in order to win this battle, we cannot deny the need for a serious weapons upgrade. If you are in doubt about how to do it, I can recommend a visit to the Revolutionary Communist Party. Every cell secretary, every comrade who's leading a cell or any other unit of the party, write this down, RCI Bulletin 23. You can print this out, study it, mark it up, and ask yourself, is my cell at this level? Are we producing this kind of atmosphere? Is this our environment? Is this where our training grounds is at? And if not, what's our plan? How are we going to get to this point where we're producing this? And it wasn't just accidental. It's not like the Danish comrades they swim in Bolshevism and then they're just ready to. Hard work produces this result. This means that everyone, and it says it in the bulletin, they expected, look, we're going to have a contact is going to be there. All right, everyone studies and prepares and does the reading and comes with something thoughtful to deliver. And the result is, you ever have one of these cell meetings that's just electric and it just leaves you feeling with energy, and then you can go and build and you can get through another week and you can keep, that's the thing that we're trying to conjure, a factory of that. That doesn't happen automatically, and it happens only when the comrades go into it saying, that's what I want to do. I want to strengthen my cell. I'm ready to bring something. Let's bring some fire this week to the cell meeting and do it each time. The results are going to be an atmosphere that produces cadres. Now, this was the way the Russian revolutionaries did it. It's not like, it was hard and it was boring, and it took years, and it was not glorious. And that was part of it. And a lot of people went through the ranks and, burnt out or disappeared or got active for a little while. The things that we're up against, we're not up against a czarist officialdom that's raiding our offices and, rounding up our comrades and sending us to prison. We don't have to worry about those things. But we're up against the pressures of life, like life under capitalism. And that means too many people, they come into the ranks, this is cool, I like this. They don't really get it, what we're doing, and eventually the pressures of life are like, okay, I'm gonna go do this, and I got other priorities in my life, maybe I'll come back, and a lot of them are coming back, and it's going well. But basically, what does that mean? It means that the general staff isn't quite at the level it needs to be in order to impart the clarity to those ranks that are coming in about what we're doing. That's why we wrote this organizational resolution, to try and help with that. Basically, it's like, if you understand Bolshevism, if you can impart to people who are new, welcome in, this is your party. But you're not just here because you're a communist and we're a communist and we're all going to talk about communism, and you're not just here because you agree with our views and you wanted to be with a group of like-minded people. What you're joining is a training grounds. That's the thing. We need to find the way to explain to contacts and new comrades, like, you're joining an ideological training grounds that will make a revolutionary out of you. And it's going to be hard and it requires your commitment, but there's a massive reward. Just get a taste of this Marxism. Once you see this clarity, I mean, that's the thing that can drive us, but you need to have that kind of environment that produces that result. How did it start in the early days? Plekhanov was the founder of Russian Marxism. Throughout the history of Bolshevism, Lenin and Trotsky were always even though he became a Menshevik and he lost his bearings, but he played a role in starting this thing out in the 1880s when there was no Marxists in Russia. And he laid the seeds, and it was patient, very thorough philosophical work. They said, Lenin and Trotsky recognized that Plekhanov educated an entire generation of revolutionaries. But in these early days, what were these discussion groups like? Well, I have here a passage from a memoir of an industrial worker who had participated in one of these propaganda circles in the 1880s. This is how they described it. The propagandist acquainted us with the struggle for a better future. He pointed out the path of our movement, the broad outlines of socialism, and told us we will attain this future only by the efforts of the working class as a whole. But to be an organizer of the working class, it is necessary to be a cultivated person, to whom others could turn with their questions, and from whom they could receive definitive answers. Therefore, it is necessary to discipline and cultivate oneself. It is necessary to learn by a definite program. A good propagandist must be able to answer such questions as why there is day and night, seasons of the year, and eclipses of the sun. He must be able to explain the origin of the universe and the origin of species. In the program must be included history, the history of culture, political economy, the history of the working class. This is depth. This is the way you train a foundation that can sustain a revolutionary movement. And you cannot skip this step. We have comrades that are doing this kind of thing. We're reading Reason and Revolt and learning about materialism. I've visited comrades and I've seen, wow, our ranks are buzzing with enthusiasm for materialism and dialectics, and this is an awesome thing. This is where it begins. There's a sequence to these things, and you can't go straight to the exciting, now we're going to do the labor movement, we're going to take things by storm, and we're going to march in. The whole what is to be done was an argument against people that just wanted to jump to the fun part. Let's storm the fortress of the Tsars, and Lenin's like, okay, yeah, you and what army? The whole thing is, how are you going to build this thing? Lenin understood you need the depth first, the rest will come from that. You need the clarity of Marxism, and you need a very thorough training in this. And that takes time, and it's not fun. It's not fun to be told, this is a patient task, it's going to take years. That's what we're telling people. That's the bitter pill. But I think we're doing a pretty good job so far of convincing plenty of people that it is worth it, and that it's a rewarding process to engage in. Lenin argued that the press was central to this. Now, this is another thing that people didn't understand back then. They don't understand it now. But I think there's basically an argument here in what is to be done and in where to begin that has been overlooked by the vast majority of people that read this stuff. The press, Lenin was arguing, it's not just that Lenin loved newspapers. Like, yeah, this is cool. You got to be able to, sell these things. And that's not what he was getting at. He was saying that the press is a benchmark for something else. It's a proxy. It's a stand-in. See, if you can do this thing, then you can do this other thing. And it's a practical metric for your political strength in general to be able to produce media, to produce a press regularly, a podcast, to be able to produce a flow of information that analyzes what's happening. Now, if this flow of information is crisp and clear and precise, if it's effective, it'll spread. If it's blurry and general and vague, it'll spread. It won't spread as well, The whole thing, the question of influence, again, we want to jump to the exciting part. We want influence. We want 10,000 people. Well, if you just enlist 10,000 people, but you don't have anything to say to those people, they're going to look for, okay, what's our marching orders? 10,000. We're here to sign up for the Bolshevism. What do we do? You need a general staff ready to say, okay, well, you unit, come with me. Here's what we're going to do. Boom. And train them and start explaining things. And you need to be able to understand events thoroughly. It begins with understanding. See, the training we're trying to imbue comrades with isn't just training like our heads are in the clouds and now we're the intelligentsia and we're studying French philosophy and now we know this thing that the rest of the working class doesn't know and we're Marxists. That's not the point, comrades. you're trying to arrive at a level of clarity that is an instrument that can allow you to get back to the concrete at a higher level, to say the thing in the way that it needs to be said, that it lands, to be able to deliver clarity in a way that no other force in the political landscape is delivering. When we can do that, then we're ready for influence. And the press, the media, and I mean that broadly, the booklets we produce, the books, the things that we're producing, and against the stream and the Communists of America, everything we're using in order to try and get our ideas out there is kind of a benchmark for our political strengths and our ability to enlist support and to get influence. And that strength manifests by you all consuming the media and spreading it. If it's effective, if it's helpful, you get an idea that's like, okay, this explained it so well. Now I understand, and I've had that moment many times, like the article, and there's an article in here, wow, now I get de-dollarization in the bond market. That was like, whoo, that one went over my head, and this article explained it, and then, comrades, remember, I went into the office and I couldn't stop talking to everyone about, you gotta read this article, you gotta read this article. Media department will circle up, we're gonna read this article together. Can the EC have a discussion about this article? This is the way the media is supposed to work. It's like, it's not just written to entertain, it's not just written to inform, it's meant to be the ammunition, that you pick up and then you use. And so if you have a strong media department, if you have a strong apparatus for producing this, then you're, here's the other thing, here's the other media department that we're up against, is Steve Bannon's. I've had this on my mind, and comrades know this is another sort of pet topic of mine. He's a vile reactionary. This is one of our enemies, one of our most determined enemies. But something about it, I find it effective, and when your enemy is effective, you need to pay attention to what's going on there. And what Steve Bannon is doing is, his view, he's like a fundamentalist Catholic, and he's a vile xenophobe. Everything comes down to the immigrants, right? All the problems, everything he says is like, this is what the immigrants are doing, and he wants to give Trump a backbone to fight back, to railroad the courts. Like, that's his program. But what is he doing? He's taking in the news and he's churning out propaganda in a prolific way. Like the podcast of Steve Bannon is called War Room, and they produce like 4 to 6 hours of podcast streaming content every single day, 6 days a week. And it's taking the headlines of the news, the headlines of everything that's happening. And Steve Bannon has shared, like, this is my media routine. I read the Financial Times every day, and I read The Guardian, and the BBC. And Steve Bannon is consuming this, and he has a team of like 15 people working on his podcast, and they're all consuming the news, and they're reading it. And in his War Room, there's a fireplace, and above the fireplace, they have MSNBC. That's like, we have to listen to the enemy and what they're saying. And they have the producers are like taking clips. And the beginning of his episode, if you watch any of this stuff, the beginning is like just a video montage of clips. This is what the mainstream media is saying. Just a couple seconds of this and a couple seconds of that. And he gives you a feel like this is the message out there, and then he comments on it. And it's the volume of what they're able to pump out. That's what allows him to be directing a current of public opinion. People can follow that, and then you guess what? There's people that will, maybe they're workers, maybe some of them are like on the shift listening. And while they're on their shift, they're like, this stuff is going into their head. We need to make the revolutionary communist version of this. We need to counter this and we need to outdo them. We need to out-organize them. We need to out-train them and out-discipline them and out-study them and out-cadre them. That is the force that we're up against. And I think if you see how they're doing it and how effective it is, then you understand this is why we're saying the paper is important. And then, what's this joker, the liberal Hassan? Is that the... And he's like...
Of course a trot is selling a newspaper. Pamphlets and newspapers. Virtually everything that you search online that is a Marxist webpage with things written on it will almost always be operated by a trot. These are, in the socialist movement, these guys are like the archivists, okay?
Okay, yeah, they don't get it. They don't see why we're doing it. We understand why we're doing it. And we need to use this to train up our cadres, and really we don't have a second to spare. That was the point on the media. Just to bring this all home, comrades, I think it's important that we wrote this as an instrument to put into your hands to help recruit. If you understand what the party's strategy is better, then you can get people on board more easily. And you can also help comrades who are new, who are building up a commitment and saying, okay, I'm trying to understand what this is. See, when I joined, it took a while. There's an interval involved. Like, you don't just join and then, boom, I'm ready to be a Bolshevik, like a lifelong committed soldier. It takes time before it took me a couple of years. Like, I joined, and my commitment was like, I'm very interested. I was very enthusiastic, but I was like, yeah, communists. I'm surrounded by communists. I'm a communist. Yay. But it took me a while to realize what this party is going to do and what role we're going to play in history. And when I did, then everything changed. And you can't just artificially, give that in a package to people. It takes time for that to sink in. Like, we are going to overthrow capitalism. We are not just saying these things. We are going to do it, comrades.
RCA! 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 RCA!
We've had a good start. I think that this party has become a factory of cadres like we've never seen before. And I see it every time I visit an area, every time I interact with comrades that I haven't seen for a while. Like, the development is happening at a pace that I have never seen before. And I think that's awesome. And really, that is the only metric of our success. That's really the thing we're trying to do here. There is a surface appearance, and then there's the reality that's happening beneath the surface. And the reality is, we are a cadre organization, and we're developing cadres. And that's the only metric that matters. What matters is not the surface number. What matters is the core of cadres, the general staff that are coming out of this military revolutionary academy, who know what they're doing in life and who know what their role in history is, and who are able to impart that to others. That is the real metric of our success. Now, there's a lot of practical things that could be said. It's always important to bring this home, and I think Trotsky had the ability to go into the theory realm and then to come back down and to bring it home. And we had a quote at the end of this resolution when the first time he was addressing Americans as comrades in the left opposition. In this letter, I think it was from 1927, wasn't it? I think it's kind of a cool moment when he's like first corresponding with the American comrades. Well, listen to what he says. We must not for a minute lose sight of the fact that the might of American capitalism rests more and more upon a foundation of the world economy with its contradictions and crises, military and revolutionary. This means that a social crisis in the United States may arrive a good deal sooner than many think and have a feverish development from the beginning. Hence the conclusion, it is necessary to prepare. And he says, for the majority of the socialists, he's talking about those people that are just kind of like socialists on the side. Like, yeah, I'll overthrow capitalism with you on the weekend. But they're not really he's understanding, if you want to build something, you can't do it in that way. You can't half it. You can't just phone it in. For the majority of the socialists, and I have in view the governing strata, their socialism is a side issue, a second-class occupation accommodated to their leisure hours. He goes on to say, these gentlemen consecrate 6 days of the week to their liberal or commercial professions. On the 7th day, they consent to occupy themselves with the saving of their souls. These are not intellectual opponents, but class enemies. He's talking about the Second International in reality. But then he brings it home. Here's what you do. Bringing it home means say, here's what you do. What is the takeaway from this? Don't just leave it in the abstract. He calls on them to find the road to the youth, to dedicate their time to training up the cadres. He says, find a few contacts, young workers, they could be teenagers. Get in touch with them and develop them into cadres. He says, remain in contact, continual contact with them. Help them in their self-education. Train them in the questions of scientific socialism and systematically introduce them to the revolutionary politics of the proletarian vanguard. What it means to be a cadre is not you learn so much and you get so smart and then now you got it and you're a cadre. You don't get a rank, you don't get a badge, you don't get said that now you're a cadre. Yay, that's not the point. That's not the point. What your measure, being a cadre means you have something to offer to other comrades and you can lift them up. Your ability to build other cadres is the thing that matters. Your ability to inspire, not to impress. Your ability to to educate and to bring things out in other comrades and to build their confidence in the ideas of Marxism in the revolutionary program. It's a thing that you can, it's not about, you don't speak in order to shine and show the comrades. You speak in order to help deliver clarity. That is the thing that a cadre is able to do. So I think, comrades, if we use these methods, and I think we know what we need to do. I mean, I've seen it, it's popping through the discussions all weekend. It's quite clear what we need to do, and I think we're about to do it on a scale that we've never seen before. I mean, the recruitment and the education of revolutionary cadres, if we use these methods, the methods that they've seen in Denmark, we're going to become a force like we haven't seen before. We will become a household name. It'll be a matter of time before the RCA starts sweeping aside any other left group. There's no competition out there. We're living in a theoretical desert. There's no Marxists out there. There's nobody talking about the things that we're talking about. There's nobody training cadres the way we're training. We have no competition. We have a wide open field. We need to get to work. That's the thing that we need to do. And if we do this, comrades, we will become a household name. We'll become the worst nightmare of the ruling class. And we will become the only hope for the working class.
Yeah, so this is a discussion on why capitalism needs war. But I think in order to fully appreciate the situation, we need to go back quite a bit in history, to the Dark Ages, actually. I'm referring, of course, to the 1990s. 1990 was only 35 years ago, but it's hard to understate just how different the world has become in this time. The USSR collapsed in 1991. And at this time, the capitalist class was euphoric. Capitalism was the dominant system basically everywhere in the world. George Bush Sr. declared a new world order. And this was supposed to be a period of unending prosperity, peace, and stability. And Francis Fukuyama even declared the end of history. Now, looking back on these words now, they sound like a cruel joke. Instead of prosperity and international cooperation, we have poverty and misery and war in one region of the world after another. In Ukraine, it's been an open war with Russia since February of 2022, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and millions have been displaced. One of the most underreported conflicts is the civil war in Sudan, which has caused the world's most devastating humanitarian crisis. More than 12 million people have been forcibly displaced, 25 million are facing acute hunger, and 600,000 are on the brink of famine. And nearly every major power in the world is involved in these events to some degree or another, some of them actually cynically supporting both sides in the conflict in order to further their own interests at the expense of the Sudanese people. You also have rising tensions between the US and China over Taiwan and the South China Sea and the region around it, mainly for control of the vital shipping routes in the region. But above all, you have the genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. For the past 22 months, Netanyahu and the IDF have inflicted a campaign of indiscriminate terror, murder, and starvation on the Palestinian people. And unable to destroy this insurgency, they've carried out atrocity after atrocity, aiming at the total annihilation of Gaza and the forced expulsion of Palestinians. And the crimes are beyond description. And Gaza is only one front in this murderous rampage. It's also carried out mass assassinations in Lebanon. It's bombed Iran's nuclear facilities and is fueling sectarian barbarism in Syria, leading to the deaths of many more civilians. And all of these wars, but especially the genocide in Gaza, have caused mass anger amongst millions of people everywhere. The flood of images of Israel's genocide, captured by the few remaining journalists in Gaza who haven't been murdered, images of famished children, all skin and bones, crowds of aid seekers machine-gunned by US mercenaries. All of this is turning public opinion worldwide against the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. And former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has warned that Israel's reputation is in collapse in the United States. And it's the same in Canada. There was a recent poll from Angus Reid that showed that more than 2/3 of Canadians consider the humanitarian crisis in Gaza to be a moral outrage. More than half consider that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute a genocide. And similar figures could be cited for practically every country around the world. In country after country, you've had mass demonstrations in support of the Palestinian people. You had the magnificent encampment movement that on the campuses across North America and Europe. And yet, nothing has changed. Despite this upsurge of public outrage, the world seems to be barreling towards violence and destruction. So why is this? Well, the ideologists of capitalism love to say, well, war is just a part of human nature, and that people are motivated by religion or racism or hatred. And perhaps I think the most infamous theory of war is developed by a man called Samuel Huntington. This is the so-called clash of civilizations. And he came up with these ideas in the early 90s, arguing that after the collapse of the USSR, the world would more and more break up into these power blocks based on culture. So, the Christian West and the Islamic world and so on and so forth. And that because we all have this evolutionary drive to fight those who don't look like ourselves, like this is the main cause of war. And this is one of the dominant ideas that the ruling class puts forward to this day. I think this argument is pretty easy to break down, because if that's true, then why are all of the Western governments going to war while the vast majority of their populations oppose these wars? The explanation actually explains nothing. It's not an accident that these racist ideas were popularized right as US imperialism was preparing to go to war in Iraq. What this actually is a thin cover to justify the dominance of US imperialism. So yeah, if we want to end these wars, we first have to understand what gives rise to them. The military theoretician, Karl Clausewitz, once famously said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, took this a step further and said that politics is simply concentrated economics. So what does he mean by this? Well, what he means is that the nature of war is ultimately determined by the economic structure of the society that wages it. And at the height of the First World War, Lenin wrote this excellent book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. I believe we have some copies of it at the literature table. And I think, in my opinion, if you want to understand the world today, you absolutely must read this book. It's over 100 years old. But to be honest, you will learn more reading this than you will learn from any other book that's been published on the subject since. In fact, the period that we're living in actually has many similarities to the period that Lenin was writing about, just before and during World War I. And what Lenin explained was that the fundamental characteristic of modern society is that the economy is dominated by monopolies. If you listen to the defenders of capitalism, they'll try to tell you that capitalism is all about free markets and free competition and all of this kind of nonsense. And there's this old washed-up politician. I was finding some quotes from him. You might remember him. His name was Justin Trudeau. His favorite phrase was, "We fight for the middle class and those working hard to join it." I think this is absolutely ridiculous. The middle class isn't growing. The reality is that the middle class has been totally obliterated. 100 years ago, a significant portion of society was actually small business owners. But more and more, they've been swallowed up by massive monopoly corporations that are able to outcompete them. And most of these people, former small business owners, have been thrown into the ranks of the working class. And this is part of the logic of the system. Karl Marx and Engels anticipated this all the way back in 1848 when they first wrote the Communist Manifesto. They explained that capitalism is a system based on competition, but because the winners can expand their operations and therefore produce more stuff for cheaper, well, then they're in an even better position to outcompete their rivals. And this process goes on and on until you have basically only a handful of massive enterprises that dominate the whole of society. So this is part of the logic of the system. And I think it's self-evident, in my opinion. But in case there's anybody here who might not be convinced, I have some stats to prove it. In Canada, 5 banks dominate the finance sector. A handful of companies control the mining industry. 4 telecom giants have monopolized communications. 3 oil corporations control all oil and gas, and 3 corporations control the media. Here's one from the Forbes Global 2000. This is an annual ranking of the largest publicly listed companies in the world. In 2024, these 2,000 companies generated $52 trillion in US revenues. They own $238 trillion in assets, which is equivalent to more than 52% of the total wealth on the planet. And this isn't even enough to show the full extent of the concentration, because all of these companies then own majority shares in other companies, and those companies own shares in other companies, and so on and so forth, in like this big capitalist pyramid. And in this way, they become part of a whole monopolist network dominated by a small group of very large enterprises. And a few years ago, there was a group of Swiss academics who studied this question in depth. They put together a database of 37 million companies around the world. And they basically tracked everything that they could find about these companies. You know, where each company's income comes from, who holds shares in what, things like this. And basically, through this, they mapped out the entire world economy. And they came to the conclusion that just 147 companies control 40% of the total wealth on the planet. And 737 companies control fully 80% of the global economy. So this is the situation that we're living in today. And yeah, at the top of this pyramid is the banks. Actually, 5 out of the 10 top companies on the Forbes 2000 are banks. Now, the banks were originally just middlemen that helped to make paying for things easier. But over time, they've accumulated so much wealth that they're now in a position to dominate the whole economy. Most companies today, even the very large ones, can't operate without taking on massive loans from the big banks. And this means that basically nothing substantial can get produced in society without the bankers giving it the okay. And this fusion of industry and banks led to the creation of what Lenin called finance capital. And this finance capital completely dominates society. It dominates the whole economy, but it also dominates the state. Now, it's a well-known fact that billionaires hate taxes. And one reason for this is that it's far more convenient for them to loan their money to the government so that they can make a nice return on their investment later on. But also, he who pays the piper chooses the tune. So this arrangement suits them very well, because that means that they can withdraw their money from the government if they deem it to not be acting in their interests. And this is a very useful protection against any socialist government, for example, that they would consider to be too left-wing, or who tries to carry out any reforms that would limit their profits. Also, the state is staffed with reliable agents that come directly from private industry. And sometimes it goes the opposite way. Politicians that have done a good job acting as basically lapdogs for the imperialists are then rewarded with lucrative positions in private industry. So for example, after leaving politics, Bill Morneau, the former finance minister, took up a very comfortable position on the board of directors of CIBC. Frank McKenna, who was the former premier of New Brunswick, is now chair of Brookfield Corporation and the deputy chairman of TD Bank. And today we have an even more obvious example. Usually you have to go and look these things up, but today we have a prime minister, Mark Carney, who is quite literally a banker. So yeah, I think in a system like this, any talk of democracy is a joke, to be honest. The government maintains democratic forms in order to try to dupe working class people. But in reality, the state is actually a vehicle for the defense of the interests of finance capital. So basically, what we have in the main, in all of the capitalist countries, is a giant machine that's been created by the elite that they use to dominate all of society. And of course, their main aim is to enrich themselves, to generate ever greater profits. But there's a problem, because under capitalism, the source of profit is actually the working class. In order for the capitalists to make a profit, it's necessary that the workers are not paid the full value of what they produce. And this means that the wages of the workers are then too low to be able to afford to buy back all of the products that they themselves are producing. And this is a major problem for the capitalists, because after all, how can you make a profit if you can't sell the stuff that you're making? And this is the thing that constantly forces the capitalists to seek out new markets, export the commodities that they can't sell at home. And this is at the center of what is behind this vicious nature of capitalism to expand at all costs. Right? This is behind the reason for the colonization of Americas by Britain and France and Spain and Portugal in the 17th and 18th centuries. The European powers needed new markets, new sources of raw materials, and they were prepared to exterminate hundreds of millions of indigenous people to make this a reality. In the late 19th century, there was the so-called scramble for Africa, where the whole continent was divided up into the colonial possessions of one or another of the European powers. In fact, it wasn't just Africa, actually. It was the whole of the world, right? It was subjected to this from Asia all the way to Latin America. And by Lenin's time, when Lenin was writing in 1916 was when he published Imperialism. By this time, the imperialists had completely divided up the world amongst themselves. Now, obviously, in the last 100 years, things have changed. The powers have changed. But the basic situation remains the same. You have a small number of very rich imperialist nations that suck all of the wealth out of the poorer countries. According to one Oxfam report, countries in the global north control 69% of global wealth, despite making up just 21% of the population. And Canada is part of this Western imperialist alliance. And Canada benefits from this mass transfer of wealth. Oxfam actually reported in Canada, the richest 1% were paid $7.2 million per day from the global south through the financial system in 2023. Obviously, this is just the banking system. I mean, this is part of the entire system as a whole. I've heard this joke going around online. People like to say that Canada is just 3 mining corporations in a trench coat. That's actually not very far from the truth, to be honest. In fact, 75% of global mining companies are headquartered in Canada. And together they control $330 billion worth of mining assets. And 2/3 of those are not in Canada. So this is imperialism. Finance capital uses its dominance of the state, the diplomatic and the military strength of the state, to secure markets and resources and cheap labor in other countries. And this constant search for sources of profit abroad is the real source of war. What imperialist war really is, it's a fight between different gangs of robbers for a bigger share of the loot. The loot, of course, being the products that have been created by the working class. But the logic of all of this is precisely what makes war an inevitability under the capitalist system. Now, the First World War was the first major inter-imperialist conflict. And of course, each power justified their entry into the war with these very lofty abstractions like defense of the fatherland or the right of nations to self-determination. And I have to also say that at the time, the left parties, the social democratic parties, were only too happy to back the capitalists in their own countries. So in Austria, the Social Democrats echoed the anti-Russian and anti-Serb propaganda of the War Party in Vienna. The opportunist wing of the Russian social democracy spoke about the threat of reactionary German imperialism and the need to come to the aid of oppressed Serbia. And all of these so-called workers' leaders eagerly rushed to support their own capitalists and voted to send millions of workers to their deaths. There was only actually a handful of socialist parties, a handful of socialists really in Europe that did their duty and opposed the war consistently. Lenin actually wrote about this. He had a quote that I like quite a bit. He said, imperialist war is like, imagine if you have one slave holder owning 200 slaves, and you have a second slaveholder owning 100 slaves, and the second one goes to war with the first one for a more just redivision of the slaves. This is precisely the real nature of imperialist war. It has nothing to do with these high-minded, lofty ideals of things like self-determination. This is about profit and division of the spoils. And this is why Lenin and the Bolsheviks went to such great lengths to study and to expose the real nature of the war. At the time, British imperialism was the dominant power. At its height, the British Empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. They controlled a similar percentage of world GDP, and they had almost exclusive control over all of the world's main shipping routes. But other imperialist powers like Germany were developing and needed access to their own colonies and their own markets. So yeah, World War I had nothing to do with self-determination. It was about breaking the domination of British imperialism and securing a redivision of the global power, obviously in favor of Germany. This was their aim. And this is the same reason why the imperialists fight wars today. So yeah, at this point, it might be reasonable for somebody to ask, okay, So Lenin says imperialism inevitably leads to war. But does it really have to be inevitable? Because after all, after World War after World War II, things seem to be, stabilizing. They weren't perfect, but at least they seem to be kind of going in the right direction. So can't we just go back to this somehow? Maybe we just need smarter leaders with better policies. Obviously, I think this is a good question. I think the thing to understand is that the historical period that we are coming out of, the period between 1945 and roughly, the present or maybe a few years ago, this was a very strange period historically. Before 1945, there was always many, great powers that were fighting for world dominance, and it was these struggles that were the ultimate causes of these wars. But because of the way in which World War II unfolded, and on the basis of this, massive post-war boom that followed it, the USA emerged massively strengthened, while all of the other imperialist powers were basically crushed. And this was reinforced by the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s and the restoration of capitalism in China. And this was the situation that was behind the so-called post-war order. The boom, turned into this massive upswing, created the conditions where capitalism in the United States was able to temporarily overcome its own limitations, and they became the organizers of world capitalism. They began to dictate world policy. They forced protectionist barriers. They forced free trade open, and they set up all of these institutions of world finance, the United Nations, the World Bank, this sort of thing, that created a certain amount of cohesion in the world economy. And the US was the only major imperialist power, and it was able to impose its will on the planet basically everywhere, single-handedly. And this meant that new world wars were ruled out. Obviously, this didn't mean that there was no war, but they became reduced to small wars where only a few million people at most were put to the slaughter. But part of the reason why there was less war was because the US was able to impose their will without the use of direct military force. They preferred instead to mainly sponsor or lead coups in dozens of countries to eliminate their enemies and install friendly regimes. And most of the wars that did happen were also initiated by the US imperialists, I have to add. They did quite a bit of that themselves. But at the time, there was actually many on the left, and even some who called themselves Marxists, that actually celebrated this. They came up with all of these kind of theories that said, oh yes, capitalism had somehow managed to overcome its contradictions. And maybe through arms expenditure or things like this, it was going to avoid booms and slumps, and eventually, thanks to all this kind of globalization, we would have a world free from war altogether. That does not sound very nice. I think this was misguided at best. I think for some of these people, perhaps the real motivation was that they were no longer interested in participating in a class struggle or fighting for workers, so they came up with these very nice new theories to soothe their consciousness and justify abandoning the struggle. But this is wrong. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is this. The workers, who are the source of profits, are not paid the full value of what they produce. And sooner or later, this means that the capitalists cannot sell their goods, and thus can't continue to make profits. The capitalists have certain ways to get around this. Debt and credit is one. Exporting capital and commodities to the imperialist-dominated countries is obviously another. But all of these solutions just end up exacerbating the problem in the long run, so that even the richest country on earth eventually ends up in crisis, right? Because this is an iron law of capitalism. In reality, the U.S. economy, despite what the stock markets might have you believe, the real U.S. economy has been in decline for some time. In 1985, the United States actually represented 36% of world GDP. In 2024, it was down to only 26%. And in the same period, China has grown from just 2.5% of world GDP to 18.5%. One thing I want to emphasize with respect to the US, this is a relative decline. The US is still the biggest and also obviously the most reactionary imperialist power on the planet. It spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. But the fact is, the US imperialism's ability to totally dominate the world has been slowly eroded over the past 35 years to the point where a totally new situation is emerging. Also, not all of the leaders of US imperialism have realized this. Actually, they became used to this kind of total power. They became colossally arrogant. But in recent years, they've actually failed in all of their major war aims. There was the embarrassing retreat in Afghanistan. There's huge amounts of debt in the economy, and big resentment within the layers of U.S. workers against any kind of new war effort. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukraine war, for example, was a massive miscalculation from the point of view of Washington. And the only consequence that this has had is that a whole group of powers that were once aligned with the United States have now aligned themselves with Russia, actually. So what this shows is that even the most powerful of the imperialist powers has its limitations. So what's happening is that there's a realignment in the balance of power in the world. This is what's taking place. And U.S. imperialism, it's still the strongest power. It's still the most reactionary force on the planet. But this relative weakening has given rise to new rising imperialist powers that have more room to maneuver. So on the one hand, you have obviously the economic powerhouse of China, but also Russia, on the other hand, are challenging the dominance of the U.S. And the Western Bloc on the world stage. And this is, this is having serious consequences at home for the Canadian ruling class. Obviously, Canada is itself an imperialist power, but it's benefited for a long time from being the junior partner of U.S. imperialism, and now it's losing out in these struggles. Just to give one example, multiple countries in West Africa have kicked out France, and they've moved closer to Russia. And as a result, the Canadian mining companies that have interests in the region are losing out. So the government of Mali, for example, which recently aligned with Russia, has seized a mine from the Canadian mining giant Barrick Gold. And similarly, Burkina Faso has nationalized 2 formerly Canadian-owned mines. The days where Canadian companies could safely profit under the backing of the Western imperialism are gone. Right? This is a completely different situation. The post-war period has ended, and with it, this era of peace and relative stability. And now you have a situation where competing capitalist powers are challenging each other for world domination. And this is what makes it similar to that period that Lenin lived in and wrote about before World War I. This is actually capitalism's normal state, right? The post-war order and that period of relative peace, this was an aberration. Right? If you look far back enough in history, in capitalist history, you'll see that the period that we're living through right now is actually average for capitalism, I guess. So obviously the ruling class tries to avoid wars wherever possible, but the truth is, this is the logic of capitalism. There isn't actually any other way for capitalism to operate than this. They've spent decades of talking about, the value of life, national sovereignty, right to self-determination. But now the imperialists are showing what their real face is. The mask has fallen off, and now they're fighting over the world like wolves over a carcass. And the policy of each country is ultimately dictated by their desire to protect their interests of their own bourgeoisie. One thing is, some people have argued that faced with unbridled U.S. power, the idea of a multipolar world where you have multiple imperialist powers vying for dominance is somehow a progressive thing, because this will allow certain oppressed countries a greater degree of sovereignty or something like this, and that somehow this is an ideal that we should fight for. But I think now, seeing the rise of wars on the world stage like we're seeing today, this is the reality of what a multipolar world looks like. This is basically giant bullies on the playground. Maybe it was before you'd have one bully on the playground that would kind of beat the shit out of everybody. Now you have 3 bullies on the playground, right? And maybe, okay, I get it, I'm a little sympathetic because you want to see the bully that bullied you get kicked in the teeth. Okay, so fair enough. But is this going to actually change the situation for working class people? No. The reality is that things are going to get much worse. What this is going to mean for ordinary people is chaos and destruction in one region of the world after another. But it's also going to mean increasing misery and poverty for working class people at home as the ruling powers are driven to increase military spending. So for example, Germany is increasing military spending from 92 billion euros to 162 billion euros, which equals a total of $649 billion over the next 5 years. And obviously things are no different in Canada. This is, Canada, the so-called peacekeeping country. Obviously this is a myth. Canada is actually the 15th largest spender on military in the world. And now Carney is planning to increase that spending to 5% of GDP, which equates to a rise from $41 billion per year to $150 billion per year. And just to put this in context, the total amount of federal funding that was spent on healthcare in 2024 was only $52 billion. So yeah, all of these spending increases are going to have to come from somewhere. And I think one thing we know for sure is that they're not going to come from the pockets of the rich. They're going to try to make workers, and they're going to try to make poor people pay for the crisis. And if these spending increases are actually going to become a reality, it means deep cuts to healthcare, deep cuts to social services, education, all of the things that ordinary people have come to rely on. And on the other hand, well, for the capitalists, all of this warmongering means, obscene profits, right? The so-called defense industry. In reality, it's a racket, right? This is a very parasitic sector, thrives on human suffering, basically. And you have these defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, and they bring in billions of dollars every year whenever there's a war. And it actually doesn't matter which side wins. The U.S. alone has spent $14 trillion on war since 2001. In Canada, you have companies like Irving Shipbuilding that have already received contracts that are worth billions of dollars. And defense stocks have risen in Canada by nearly 40% in the last year alone. So what does all of this mean? I think what makes Lenin's analysis of imperialism so powerful is that it puts to one side everything that's unnecessary in politics and lays bare the real fundamental processes that give rise to modern war. And the ultimate conclusion is this. As long as the economy is ruled by capitalist monopolies, as long as the state serves the interests of finance capital, the horrors of war will continue. And war is inevitable under capitalism. And obviously, there's also peace under capitalism. Capitalists don't wage war all of the time. They do it for a certain reason. They do it to make profits. It wouldn't be in their interest to do it forever. But under capitalism, peace can only prepare the conditions for another war, another barbaric imperialist war at some point in the future. By explaining the process from its roots, it's possible to see where war comes from, but also how it can be ended. And I think also it's just as important to say it's possible to say what tactics are not possible in ending war. What absolutely won't work is attempts to appeal to the ruling class or to its political representatives to stop the genocide. You can't convince finance capital to stop acting like a finance capitalist any more than you could convince a tiger to go vegetarian. I think war is not simply a bad policy. It's actually built into the DNA of capitalism itself. And this can be seen from the two-faced approach that Mark Carney and the liberals are taking toward Palestine. Because, they're no longer able to hide the truth. So all of the Western governments are now, they're trying to respond to this upsurge of anger. They're trying to appear critical of Israel. So in January, the Canadian government adopted a freeze on issuing permits for weapons to be shipped to Israel. In April, Carney even claimed that Canada had an arms embargo on Israel. And last month, Canada, along with Britain and France, all announced plans to recognize a Palestinian state. Carney put out a statement. He says, "The deepening suffering of civilians leaves no room for delay in coordinated international action to support peace, security, and the dignity of all human life." I think the hypocrisy in these words is absolutely nauseating. To this day, the Canadian arms manufacturers continue to supply the weapons necessary for the Israeli army to continue its genocide. And this was actually exposed in detail in a report that was written recently called "Exposing Canadian Military Exports to Israel." And this was put together by a few different groups, including the Palestinian Youth Movement, World Beyond War, and Independent Jewish Voices, along with a few others. And this is what the report has to say. I think it's very interesting. It says, "The Canadian government appears to have pursued a strategy of rushing through a record-breaking number of arms export permit approvals to Israel prior to publicly committing to pause of approving any new ones. This was then quietly undermined by a series of exceptions and loopholes that were only acknowledged when exposed through media investigations or parliamentary scrutiny. This indicates that the government's policy shifts were more symbolic than substantive, aimed at diffusing public criticism while maintaining material support." So yeah, not only did military exports to Israel continue after this so-called freeze, but exports in 2024 exceeded any previous year on record. Israel was actually the fourth largest customer of the Canadian defense industry in 2024. They got nearly $19 million in weapons shipments. So this actually shows you the real nature of the liberals, right? They love to cry crocodile tears about the horrors of war. They call for diplomacy and restraint while actually themselves participating in the worst atrocities. However, I have to say, in the conclusion to their report, the authors call for the government to abide by their obligations under domestic and international law, to stop supporting the genocide, and to impose an arms embargo. I think what the report itself actually says is that the ruling class has no scruples, right? They will say whatever